Good afternoon, everybody. Investment in infrastructure is necessary and expensive. This is recognised by New South Wales Government's funding allocation for recycling and resource recovery infrastructure. Successful business cases planning will not only achieve funding, but also can result in other benefits to the community beyond the infrastructure stated purpose. My presentation really is going to illustrate through a range of examples around Australasia, both New Zealand and Australia, some successful and some not so successful projects, and it highlights some of the issues that you need to be aware of when developing business plans and identifies some of the things that can actually go wrong. So what needs to be considered when looking at an infrastructure project? There's a whole range of different things. There's obviously the financials, the capex, the opex. You've got supply and markets. You've got the community perception, economic benefits. Obviously, you need to do detailed project planning around looking at the design, construction and operation phases of a project. It needs to be technically feasible, fit for purpose, and do you need to look at staging the works to make it stack up? There's also the risk management aspects. You need to know about the what-ifs, often through scenario modelling. But where do you start? Maximising diversion of waste from landfill is a given, obviously. But what is the council seeking? You need to be clear about your objectives. Is there a social public good element to the project, or are you seeking maximum profit, least cost to council? So, are you going for a commercially driven model only? So you need to define the scope up front. In terms of actually a business case, obviously it needs to be fit for purpose. It needs to be able to convince those that are actually giving the green light to the project that it should go ahead. Some of the issues that we've seen through the examples, which I'll expand upon later, around capital expenditure. Often it's unrealistic. You haven't budgeted enough. I mean, the OPEX costs also aren't properly identified, so you don't have whole of life costings. Often projects that we've seen overestimate the revenue that you can get from the products that you sell from your business. There's uncertainty in markets. You're relying on certain markets to be available, and often the research isn't done. A number of times there's agreements. You've either got shared services agreements, and in the New Zealand examples there's a lot of PPP type schemes. Having those locked down and having the contribution of costs and the allocation of profits clearly identified is key. Having governance structures in place, I'll show through some of the examples that often it's set up with the inappropriate governance structures. And the last one is just making sure that your grant applications are successful, so having a robust case to achieve those. Okay, so the first few slides, I just want to illustrate some of the projects there that didn't go quite so well. The first one's an example in Australia. This one here was a resource recovery facility, which was known for its leadership and sustainability practices and landfill diversion. The facility was owned, operated and funded by council, and it provided a range of services. The Resource Recovery Centre, while the original business case showed it was going to operate at a profit, had been operating at a marginal loss for quite a number of years, and in particular the organic side of things was a concern for council. So we were asked to come and have a look at it and provide an overview. So, as with any case, there's lots of positives. Obviously they had great people. They were enthusiastic, environmentally passionate, and they're sort of living the business. They were meeting waste diversion targets, which is a big plus, and it had great community buy-in. It was like a hub for the community. However, it had a number of negatives as well. What they were doing was producing organics material, but they were producing a number of grades of material, compost, so they were spending excessive amounts of money trying to provide product. The difficulty for them was they didn't get the revenue to actually pay for that. So what we found is that if you actually looked at how much it was costing them to produce a tonne of compost material, it was actually so high that they couldn't actually sell it for that price. So they hadn't actually done the research properly. And as it turned out, they were never going to actually achieve a break-even. So the markets just weren't there. The learnings from this one here is obviously research your markets, produce the product that the market needs and do not overinvest. Need to set realistic rates. And I think one of the other learnings from this is that while they had passionate people, they didn't have people with commercial knowledge. So there was people, they needed expertise in sales, pricing, negotiating deals, and it just wasn't there. The second project is one in New Zealand. This one here is a not-for-profit organisation that was doing recycling, resource recovery services for a council. Council was providing about $1 million worth of funding per year, and in this particular case, the issue was around increasing costs, but the council felt that the service levels were decreasing. The positives in this particular one was, again, community perception. It was a hub of community. It was actually creating jobs. One of their focuses was, it was a philanthropic type exercise where they're actually providing jobs for people that couldn't get jobs elsewhere. And they had a great education focus. So that was where their real strength lay. The trouble is that they'd actually expanded into other areas. They'd actually got into curbside recycling as well as resource recovery. And they'd actually got into an area where they didn't actually have the skills to do it. So they were lacking expertise based on the management front, but also at a board level. They had a board, and it was made up of a mixture of councillors and community representatives, which whenever we do business case analysis, we sort of say stay clear of doing that. You should actually look at having a board with the skills you need, financial skills, business skills, engineering skills, but have a range of skills. Financial control was lacking as well. As I mentioned, they didn't have the business skills, but they also didn't have capital in which to invest in the business. So what they were doing is running it on the smell of an oily rag, and what they were faced with was ageing plant that needed maintenance. They'd have to actually fix their loaders, their diggers, and what would happen is that would suck up any additional cash. So it's just non-sustainable. And a key thing on this one here was lack of clarity as well. There was a lack of service agreements and contracts with council. So what that meant was that council's expectations weren't clear, and the contractor wasn't sure if he was meeting them or what sort of service levels he should provide. So there was, this lack of clarity was creating ongoing problems. So I guess that's the key thing for that one, just that lack of focus, needing proper governance and management in place, and having appropriate funding arrangements. Third example is a biodigester plant in New Zealand. This was set up to process green waste and biosolids. This facility again was constructed, funded and managed under control of council. And this one here, the positives in this one is that they set up the facility and they actually had a trial period. So they set it up to operate for a year. It actually went for about 2 or 3 years before they reviewed it. But at least they had a process to actually checks and balances before they invested more money in it. They also had a modular facility, so they installed something that could actually had capacity to provide for a select area, and then the intention was to expand that. So they actually planned in advance, just in case things went wrong. In this particular one, they had done a lot of business case work, but their financial analysis was so complicated it was impossible for the council staff to unpick it. So what they found is that there was a number of assumptions and dependencies within the model, which just made it impossible for staff to interpret. So they had to get us in to actually look at it again. So this was a case where the technical people had gone berserk, and it wasn't really fit for purpose. Also, initial assumptions had changed in that the original business case, when they looked at options, had been built on the premise that landfilling was going to be a more expensive option. In this particular case, council went ahead and negotiated a deal with the landfill operator to get cheap disposal rates, which, on one instance, they'd actually done a good job, and the other instance, they actually undermined this project. So they had that sort of issue of trying to actually work out whether this still was the cheapest option. And the third problem in this particular one was security and quality of the supply of feedstock. In this particular case, they were relying on biosolids from a treatment plant. The trouble was they had difficulties with the quality and quantity of materials they got from that. They also needed green waste tonnages for the mix, and originally they estimated they'd get certain quantities. They found out, in fact, that they didn't get those quantities and they actually had to buy material in. So it ended up costing a lot more money than they thought. So the learnings from this one here was really be prepared to review at an early stage. You need a business case that's fit for purpose, and make sure that you have supply of materials locked up. Okay, just want to talk about a couple of projects that when we looked at it, they actually stacked up quite well, successful ones. This one here's an Australian one. So we looked at it, did a peer review of a business case for the construction operation of a MRF for handling of mixed recyclable materials. This project involved 3 councils looking at it, but there was one lead council that was taking the lead and were developing the facility. So the positives in this one, that it was really good project planning. They'd done a lot of design, construction, and work around the operational costs, so they had all their costs well identified. They'd done a number of work around financial scenarios, looking at the what-ifs. If one council was to do it, if another council came on board and then another council, what did it look like? But they always had the option of just them doing it by themselves to give them a sort of bottom line to see if it would stack up if everything else went wrong. And then the last thing they did is they had a really good risk assessment peer review process. So what they did is they did all the work and they built in a process for getting an independent third party to have a look at it to see how it stacked up. So for this one, there was a few little negatives, nothing major. The initial business case, they failed to look at the whole lot of costs. So while they had the initial costs really well identified, ongoing costs weren't so clearly identified. So the ongoing obligations for each of the councils wasn't as clear as it could have been. And while they'd based a lot of their assumptions around the fact that they'd have contractual commitments, they were all sort of handshake type arrangements. There was nothing in writing. And so, there was a need to actually make sure they had the contracts and the requirements locked down, just to make sure that they weren't sort of like blindsided later on. So I guess the key things there was really around that certainty of arrangements and making sure that you look at the full cost of the life of the facility. Okay, and this is one more example here of a successful project. This one here is in New Zealand, and this one here we had 3 councils from a region wishing to gain greater control over the resource recovery quantities in the area. So they planned a joint collection, shared service collection service, but they also looked at developing a new resource recovery facility. And this one here, the facility was going to be owned and constructed by one council, and they were going to have arrangement with the other 2 councils to either have a shareholding in the facility or enter into a long-term contract to supply tonnages to it. And in this one here, in terms of the positives, obviously there was a strong lead council. They secured the land and made sure that there was security around the site. They looked for a joint venture partner, and I know New Zealand's slightly different from Australia in terms of that, but they looked for a private equity partner that could come on board, that could potentially provide funding for the project. As it turned out, they didn't. Council decided that it was cheaper for them to fund it themselves, but they had that option there. And then also look at the private business to actually use their expertise to develop and operate the site and also provide security of tonnages. They also looked at stage development. So they looked at developing the facility over an 8-year period. So the first stage was to develop the transfer station and MRF. They moved then into resource recovery with C&D, waste resale shop, and then to organic. So they had a staged approach where they were going to actually check out, see how the facility was operating before they moved on to the next stage. And that security of tonnages was a key aspect as well, is that they were looked at have agreements. They had the 3 councils that could supply tonnages, but they're looking for the commercial company to actually provide the commercial tonnages, because a lot of these facilities, economies of scale is critical. And the fact here is that because we could actually scale up the facility to take a significant amount of commercial tonnages, it meant that council could enjoy the benefits from that in terms of having or getting subsidies effectively from the commercial operations. So there wasn't actually a lot of negatives in this one. I guess the issue, the only real negative I think was in terms of actually having an exit strategy, which in this particular case, one of the things they did plan for is actually making sure that if the actual operation, if the agreement turns sour, there was the ability to actually exit from the agreement. So for them, they clearly stated, what were the conditions and what were the financial implications if one of the parties to pull out. And there was the ability for either party to actually pick up the part of the agreement that the other party wanted to get out of. So the key things here really was partnerships can provide benefits in terms of scale and reducing risk. So whether they be from other councils or they be through private parties. So that allows you to get scale and also to secure tonnages. Okay, so the last example is actually not a waste example, so I've just thrown this in here, but this one here is relating to an Australian project where they did a preparation for a funding application for investment in some critical regional infrastructure. So this was a successful application, not made through the Waste Fund, but I guess this showed some of the key things, that there was strong strategic alignment with both state government and council planning, and there was a focus as well as providing a cost-effective service to drive regional economic growth. There was significant economic analysis around in comparison of options, cost-benefit analysis, and again that economic assessment. And it was very good in terms of the affordability, making sure that the whole of life costings were identified. I mean, a lot of these projects I've talked about have lifespans of 20 to 30 years, and it's just making sure that they're viable for that sort of period into the future. Okay, so what does it all mean? Okay, there's lots of examples of infrastructure projects around that have failed or need to be propped up, both in New Zealand and Australia. There's also lots of examples of successful projects that provide economic and environmental benefits to the communities. I mean, you know, what differentiates them? I think to give you the best chance of a successful project, it's key to prepare a robust business case that is fit for purpose and then monitor how it's going. I mean, from the examples I've sort of illustrated, I mean, some of the learnings that we've taken out of it is, you know, undertake that robust financial analysis, look at the whole of life costs, identify and manage the risks, look at the partnerships that minimise the risks. So what can add benefit? And I think collaboration is key in all of these projects, because in terms of the scale, often there's a lot of risk if one council actually tries to go it alone. Be realistic in terms of the revenues and markets, and look at the various scenarios, and also put in the right governance and management structure in place. And then lastly, just monitor the things to see if there's any changes in what needs to change to actually make sure it works into the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Ewen.